Imagine locking yourself away from the world for an entire year, not because you're weak, but because you're afraid of what strength might cost you. Nathaniel Cross, heir to the most exclusive hotel empire in the world, disappeared the night his father died. No interviews, no public appearances, just silence, and a penthouse suite on the 47th floor that became his prison. They say grief makes you small, but Nathaniel's grief made him untouchable. Then one night, alone in that vast penthouse, he collapsed, not from illness, but from the weight of pretending he didn't need anyone. And the woman who found him? She wasn't supposed to be there at all. Can a man who built walls to survive learn to let someone in before those walls bury him alive? Stay until the end. And if you believe true strength is found in vulnerability, like this video and subscribe. Nathaniel controlled everything from behind closed doors, board meetings via encrypted calls, decisions delivered through his assistant, an empire run by a ghost. He told himself it was strategy, protection, control. But control is just fear wearing a suit. For 12 months he lived like a king in exile, surrounded by luxury, suffocated by silence. The penthouse stretched endlessly, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered and moved and lived without him. Marble floors that echoed his footsteps, rooms he no longer entered because emptiness has a way of multiplying in space. He worked, he strategized, he survived, but surviving isn't living. And on a cold October night, his body finally said what his mind refused to admit. Enough. He collapsed in the living room, vision blurring, chest tight, hands trembling against the cold floor. Not a heart attack, not a stroke. Just exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding everything together while falling apart inside. He didn't call for help. He couldn't, because asking for help meant admitting he was human, and humans break. But someone heard him anyway. Iris Delgado, a housekeeper who worked the late shift, heard the sound through the service hallway, a quiet, ragged breath that didn't belong in the silence of the 47th floor. She wasn't supposed to be there. That floor was forbidden, off limits, reserved for the ghost everyone whispered about but no one saw. But Iris had learned long ago that rules were written by people who never had to choose between obedience and conscience. She used her master key. The door opened to darkness, and a man on the floor, pale, trembling, staring at nothing. "Sir, get out." His voice was barely a whisper, but the command was absolute. Iris didn't move. She knelt beside him, close enough to see the exhaustion carved into his face, the way his hands shook when he tried to push himself up. "You need help. I need you to leave. I will, after I know you're safe." Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in a year someone held his gaze without fear, without pity, without agenda. Just steady, present. There. He hated it. He hated that she didn't flinch. Hated that her eyes were kind without being soft. Hated that she saw him like this, raw, broken, human. "I don't need your compassion." "Good, because I'm not offering it." She stood, walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and set it on the table beside him. "I'm offering basic decency. That's not the same thing." Then she left. No dramatics, no lingering. Just the quiet click of the door and the faint scent of lavender from the hallway. Nathaniel sat there in the dark, staring at the glass of water like it was a challenge. Because it was. The next morning he called his head of security, the woman who was on the 47th floor last night. "Find out who she is." "Sir, protocol requires—" "I don't care about protocol. I want her name." 30 minutes later, he had it. Iris Delgado, 28, originally from a small coastal town, no family in the city, worked double shifts to send money home. Clean record, quiet, reliable, unremarkable. Except she wasn't. Because unremarkable people don't walk into forbidden rooms. They don't ignore direct orders from billionaires. They don't look at broken men and choose to stay. Nathaniel told himself he was curious, that's all. Curiosity wasn't attachment. It wasn't weakness, it was just interest. He began watching her, not physically, he wasn't a monster, but through the hotel's discreet management systems, he could see her schedule, her movements, the floors she cleaned, the hours she kept. She worked like someone who believed work had dignity. No shortcuts, no complaints, just quiet, relentless care for spaces most people never noticed. And every night at 11 p.m., she passed his floor. She never stopped, never looked up at the penthouse elevator, never tried to see him again. It drove him insane, because Nathaniel Cross was used to people wanting something from him, money, access, validation. But Iris Delgado wanted nothing. And that made her the most dangerous person he'd ever met. 2 weeks after the collapse, Nathaniel made a decision. He left the penthouse, not to return to the world, not yet, but to go down one floor, to the executive suites, to the place where hotel operations hummed quietly beneath the surface of luxury. He told himself it was about reclaiming control, about proving he could still move through his own empire without breaking. But when he saw Iris in the hallway, pushing a cleaning cart with the same calm focus she'd had that night, he knew the truth. He hadn't come down to reclaim anything. He'd come down because he needed to know if she'd look at him the same way twice. She didn't notice him at first. She was adjusting fresh linens, her movements efficient, almost meditative. Then she turned. Their eyes met, and for a single, infinite second, neither of them moved. "Mr. Cross." Her voice was steady, professional. But there was something underneath it, a question she didn't ask. "Miss Delgado." He didn't know what to say, didn't know why he was standing there like a man who'd forgotten his own language. She waited. "Thank you," he finally said, "for that night." Iris studied him quietly. "You don't owe me anything." "I know." She nodded, turned back to her cart. But before she walked away, she said something that stopped his heart. "Just don't waste it." Nathaniel stood there long after she was gone, those 4 words echoing in the silence. Don't waste it. What did that mean? Waste what? His life? His grief? His year of hiding? Or the fact that someone had seen him at his lowest and hadn't turned away? He didn't know. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Iris Delgado had just become the only person in the world who could destroy him. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. He stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the city breathe below him. Thousands of lights, thousands of lives moving forward, while his remained suspended in glass and silence. Just don't waste it. 4 words, a stranger's voice. And suddenly, the year he'd spent building walls felt like time stolen from himself. He'd convinced himself that isolation was strength, that distance was protection, that if he didn't let anyone close, he couldn't be hurt again. But Iris had walked into his carefully constructed fortress and left something behind. Not pity, not judgment, just a quiet challenge wrapped in 4 words. And Nathaniel Cross had never been able to ignore a challenge. The next day, he did something he hadn't done in 12 months. He walked through his hotel, not as a ghost giving orders from above, but as a man, flesh, breath, presence, moving through the empire his father built and he'd inherited like a crown made of thorns. The staff froze when they saw him. Whispers rippled through marble hallways. The reclusive heir, the broken king, the man who vanished. He ignored them all. He moved through the lobby with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, past the concierge desk where employees straightened instinctively, through the restaurant where waiters paused mid-service. He was looking for one person, and he found her on the 8th floor, cleaning a suite that had just been vacated. Iris worked with the same quiet focus he'd observed before, methodical, present, as if the act of making something clean and whole again mattered deeply to her. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway. Nathaniel watched her smooth, fresh sheets across the bed, the way her hands moved with practiced grace, the way she paused for just a moment to straighten a painting on the wall that was already perfectly level. She cared about details no one would notice, about work most people dismissed as invisible, and something in his chest, something that had been frozen for a year, cracked. He must have made a sound because Iris turned. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no nervousness. Just that same steady gaze that had unnerved him from the beginning. She didn't ask why he was there, didn't offer empty pleasantries. She just waited. Nathaniel stepped into the room, and for the first time in months, he felt the absurdity of his own power. He owned this building, employed hundreds, controlled an empire worth billions. But standing in front of this woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, he felt like a man who'd forgotten how to be human. He wanted to thank her again, to explain, to justify his isolation, his collapse, his year of hiding. But the words died in his throat. Because what do you say to someone who saved you without asking for credit? Iris folded the towel in her hands, set it on the cart, and looked at him with something that might have been understanding. Then she walked past him, her shoulder almost brushing his, and continued down the hallway to the next room. No conversation, no moment, just work. And Nathaniel realized with stunning clarity, she wasn't interested in his gratitude. She was interested in him proving he meant it. Over the following days, he kept appearing. Not dramatically, not obviously, just there. In hallways she cleaned, near break rooms during her shifts, by the service elevators when she finished for the night. He never spoke, never interrupted her work. He just existed in her proximity, like a man learning to breathe again. The staff noticed. Of course they noticed. Rumors spread like wildfire through the hotel, whispered conversations about the heir and the housekeeper, speculation wrapped in scandal. But Iris ignored it all. She worked, she moved. She existed with the same quiet dignity she'd always had. And slowly, carefully, Nathaniel began to understand something profound. Iris Delgado wasn't impressed by his wealth, wasn't intimidated by his power, wasn't seduced by his name. She saw him as what he was beneath all of it, a man who'd been hiding from grief and didn't know how to stop. One evening, 3 weeks after their first encounter, Nathaniel found himself in the hotel's service corridor, a place executives never went, a hidden network of hallways where the real work happened. Iris was there taking her break, sitting on a metal folding chair with a thermos of tea and a worn paperback book. She looked up when he approached, but didn't close the book. Nathaniel sat on the floor across from her, back against the concrete wall, expensive suit crumpling against industrial paint. They didn't speak. She read. He breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. And for the first time in a year, Nathaniel felt something that terrified him more than grief, more than loneliness, more than the weight of an empire. He felt seen, not as the heir, not as the recluse, not as the broken man on the floor, just as himself. Iris turned a page, took a sip of tea, glanced at him once, quick assessing, then returned to her book. And Nathaniel realized he was in serious trouble, because somewhere between collapsing in his penthouse and sitting on a concrete floor in a service hallway, he'd stopped being curious about Iris Delgado. He'd started needing her, not romantically, not yet, but in a way that was somehow more dangerous. He needed her presence like oxygen, needed her steadiness like gravity, needed her quiet refusal to treat him as anything other than human. She finished her tea, closed her book, and stood, looked down at him with those impossibly calm eyes, and said nothing. But as she walked away, she left her thermos on the chair, still warm, still half full. An invitation, a test, a gesture so small it could mean nothing or everything. Nathaniel picked it up, felt the heat against his palms, and knew with absolute certainty he was about to risk everything he'd spent a year protecting, and he had no idea if she'd catch him when he fell. The thermos sat on Nathaniel's desk for 3 days. He didn't return it, didn't acknowledge it, just kept it there, a small steel cylinder that somehow held more weight than every contract, every report, every million-dollar decision surrounding it, because returning it meant something. And Nathaniel wasn't sure he was ready for what that something might be. He'd spent a year mastering distance, perfecting absence, turning isolation into an art form so refined that even his own reflection felt like a stranger. But Iris had walked into his carefully controlled world and left cracks everywhere, small fissures that let light in, and with it, all the things he'd been avoiding. Hope, longing, the terrifying possibility that he might still be capable of connection. On the fourth day, he found her in the rooftop garden, a hidden space most guests never discovered, where the hotel's maintenance staff grew herbs for the restaurant and took breaks between the machinery and greenery. Iris was repotting basil, her hands dark with soil, her face tilted toward the late afternoon sun. She didn't look up when he approached. Nathaniel set the thermos on the wooden bench beside her, cleaned and refilled with the same tea he'd tasted that night, jasmine and honey, delicate and warm. Iris glanced at it, then at him. Her expression revealed nothing. But she picked it up, unscrewed the cap and took a slow sip, as if testing whether he'd remembered correctly, whether he'd paid attention to something as small as the way she took her tea. He had. She set the thermos down, returned to her work, and after a long silence spoke without looking at him. The words came quiet, matter of fact, as if discussing the weather rather than dismantling his defenses. She asked why he'd locked himself away. Not accusatory. Just curious, the way someone might ask about a scar, acknowledging its existence without demanding explanation. Nathaniel stood there, surrounded by rosemary and thyme, city skyline stretching endlessly behind them, and felt something inside him surrender. He told her about his father, not the public story, not the carefully crafted legacy, but the truth, about a man who built an empire but forgot to build a relationship with his son, about expectations that felt like chains, about inheriting everything except the one thing he actually wanted, approval, about the night his father died, how Nathaniel had been on a business call, closing a deal, proving his worth, while his father's heart gave out 3 floors below. About the guilt that followed, the realization that he'd spent so long trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it that he'd never learned what love actually looked like. About waking up the next day as the sole owner of everything his father built, and feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. So he disappeared. Not because he was weak, but because facing the world meant facing the fact that all his success, all his power, all his carefully constructed worth, none of it had been enough. Iris listened without interrupting, her hands still working the soil, grounding herbs in earth while Nathaniel uprooted truths he'd buried for a year. When he finished, she didn't offer comfort, didn't minimize his pain or rush to fix it. She just asked one question, simple, devastating, impossible to avoid. She asked what he was afraid would happen if he stopped hiding. Nathaniel looked at her, this woman who somehow saw through every wall he'd built, and answered with an honesty that terrified him, that people would see him and realize there was nothing special underneath, that his father had been right, that Nathaniel was competent but not exceptional, successful but not worthy, powerful but not enough, that if he let people close, they'd eventually leave, and he wasn't sure he could survive being abandoned again. Iris set down the plant she'd been working on, wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked directly at him. What she said next broke something fundamental in his chest. She told him that worth wasn't something you earned through achievement or proved through perfection, that he'd been asking the wrong question his entire life, not, am I enough? But enough for whom? That his father's inability to see him wasn't a reflection of Nathaniel's value. It was a reflection of his father's limitations. That grief wasn't something you conquered or controlled. It was something you carried. And sometimes, if you were lucky, someone would help you carry it. She stood, picked up the thermos and took another sip, slow, deliberate, as if giving him time to absorb words that felt like sunlight on frostbite. Then she did something that changed everything. She took his hand, calloused fingers wrapping around his palm, warm and steady and real, and placed it against the soil of the plant she'd been repotting. Told him to feel it, the dirt, the roots, the way something could be buried and still grow. Nathaniel knelt there in the rooftop garden, his expensive suit collecting dust and earth, his hand guided by hers, feeling the pulse of something alive beneath the surface. And he understood. Iris wasn't trying to fix him. She was showing him that broken things could still bloom, that being planted in darkness didn't mean you were meant to stay there. That growth required being willing to push through soil, even when it was heavy and dark and suffocating. That reaching toward light meant first acknowledging you'd been buried. She released his hand, left him kneeling in the garden, and walked toward the rooftop door. But before she left, she turned back, just for a moment, and her expression held something he hadn't seen before. Not pity, not kindness, recognition, as if she'd been buried too, as if she knew exactly what it felt like to dig yourself out, root by root, toward something that might be sunlight. Nathaniel stayed in that garden until the sky turned violet and the city lights began their nightly symphony below. His hand still smelled like earth. His suit was ruined. His carefully maintained distance was shattered beyond repair. And for the first time since his father died, Nathaniel Cross felt something more powerful than grief. He felt the dangerous, terrifying, overwhelming possibility that he might actually want to live again. Something shifted after the garden. Nathaniel stopped pretending he wasn't searching for her. He'd find reasons to walk through sections of the hotel he'd never visited, the laundry rooms where industrial machines hummed like heartbeats, the storage areas where linens were stacked in perfect white towers, the back corridors where staff moved like ghosts between the glamorous facade and the machinery that sustained it. And always, somehow, there she was. Iris folding sheets with mathematical precision. Iris checking inventory with a clipboard and focused eyes. Iris training a new employee with patient gestures and quiet authority. She never acknowledged his presence, never paused her work, never gave any indication that she noticed him watching. But she knew. He could tell by the way her shoulders relaxed slightly when he appeared, the way she'd position herself so he could see what she was doing, not showing off, just including him in the rhythm of her world. It became a silent language between them. He would appear. She would work. And in the space between presence and absence, something grew that neither of them named. Nathaniel started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The way morning light hit the marble floors of the lobby at exactly 6:43, turning ordinary stone into liquid gold. The sound of elevator cables singing as they carried people between floors, mechanical poetry. The scent of fresh coffee mixing with furniture polish in the early hours when the hotel was still half asleep. Iris had done this, had taught him, without words, without intention, to see his own empire as something more than profit margins and occupancy rates. She'd shown him it was a living thing, hundreds of people moving through routines that mattered, creating beauty and comfort and small moments of grace for strangers who'd never know their names. One morning, Nathaniel found himself in the employee break room at 5 a.m., a space he'd never entered in all his years of ownership. Worn furniture, mismatched mugs, a bulletin board covered in staff announcements, birthday cards, photos of co-workers' children, evidence of life, community, the invisible ecosystem that sustained everything he'd built. Iris was there making tea before her shift, and when she saw him, something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that he was finally seeing what had always been there. She poured a second cup without asking, set it on the counter between them and left. No words, no explanation, just an offering. Nathaniel held the mug, cheap ceramic, chipped at the rim, and felt wealthier than he'd ever felt in his penthouse surrounded by crystal and gold. The hotel's executive team noticed the change. Nathaniel started attending meetings in person, started walking the property, started asking questions that had nothing to do with revenue, questions about staff morale, working conditions, the small frustrations that accumulated into larger problems. His COO called it a positive development. His board called it encouraging engagement. His publicist called it a potential comeback narrative. But Nathaniel knew the truth. He wasn't returning to power. He was learning to be present, and Iris was the reason why. He began leaving things for her, not gifts, nothing that could be misinterpreted as wealthy man attempting to buy attention from staff member, just considerations. A new ergonomic handle for the cleaning carts after he noticed her rubbing her wrist, a revised break schedule that gave housekeeping staff an extra 15 minutes, a policy change that provided healthcare coverage for part-time employees. Changes that would affect everyone, yes, but changes he made because he'd watched Iris work herself to exhaustion and realized she shouldn't have to. She never thanked him, never acknowledged these shifts. But one day, he found a small succulent plant on his desk, the same kind from the rooftop garden, replanted in a simple clay pot. No note, no explanation, just a living thing that required attention, care, consistency, a reminder that growth didn't happen through grand gestures. It happened through showing up day after day, even when no one was watching. Nathaniel kept that plant on his desk and watered it religiously. Weeks passed like this, a strange courtship conducted entirely in silence, in presence, in the negative space between what was said and what was understood. They developed routines that felt like rituals. He'd find her in the rooftop garden during her breaks. She'd make space for him without invitation. They'd sit in silence, her reading, him thinking, both existing in proximity that somehow felt more intimate than conversation. Sometimes she'd show him things, how to deadhead flowers, how to tell when soil needed water just by feeling its weight, how to be patient with growth that happened too slowly to see. And Nathaniel, who'd spent his life measuring success in quarterly reports and stock prices, learned to measure it in green shoots and steady breath. He was changing, not dramatically, not obviously, but the man who'd locked himself away for a year was slowly, carefully, learning to exist in the world again. And the woman who'd found him on the floor of his penthouse, who'd offered basic decency instead of pity, was teaching him something his father never had. That strength wasn't about control, it was about vulnerability. That power wasn't about distance, it was about connection. That worth wasn't something you proved. It was something you carried quietly, in the everyday act of choosing to show up. One evening, as autumn turned the city gold and crimson, Nathaniel stayed late in the rooftop garden. Iris was there, as she often was, tending to plants that would soon need to be moved inside for winter. He watched her work, the gentleness in her movements, the attention she gave to each plant as if it were the only one that mattered, and he realized with absolute clarity that he'd been wrong about everything. He hadn't fallen for Iris because she saved him. He'd fallen for her because she'd refused to, because she'd looked at a broken man and hadn't tried to fix him, had simply offered presence, consistency, the quiet insistence that he was capable of fixing himself. She'd given him the most radical gift anyone had ever given him. She'd believed he was worth the effort of showing up. The sun dropped below the skyline. The city lights flickered on like stars being born. And Nathaniel Cross, heir to an empire, stood in a rooftop garden and finally understood what his father never taught him. Love wasn't something you earned through perfection. It was something you built through presence, patience, and the courage to be seen. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. Not Nathaniel's collapse, he'd already had his. This time, it was Iris. He found her in a supply closet on the 14th floor, sitting on an overturned bucket, hands pressed against her face, shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness. Silent, controlled. The cry of someone who'd learned long ago that breaking down was a luxury reserved for private moments, stolen between shifts. Nathaniel froze in the doorway. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to give her privacy, to respect boundaries, to maintain the careful distance they'd constructed over months of silent understanding. But he remembered the night she'd found him. How she'd stayed when he demanded she leave. How she'd refused to let him disappear into his own darkness. He stepped inside and closed the door. Iris didn't look up, didn't tell him to go. Just kept breathing through tears that seemed to be tearing her apart from the inside. Nathaniel sat on the floor across from her, expensive shoes on industrial linoleum, the fluorescent light humming overhead like a mechanical prayer. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't offer empty comfort. He just stayed. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 30. Time felt irrelevant in that small space where two people existed in the wreckage of their respective wounds. Eventually, Iris lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. Her face was raw. But her voice, when it came, was steady, the kind of steady that only comes from practice, from years of holding yourself together when falling apart wasn't an option. She told him without preamble, without softening the edges. Her mother was sick, terminal. The treatment was experimental, expensive, impossible. Iris had been sending money home for months. Every extra shift, every saved dollar, every sacrifice she could make without collapsing herself. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And today she'd received the call. Her mother had weeks, maybe days. The hospital wanted to know about arrangements, about final wishes, about all the bureaucratic necessities that come with watching someone you love disappear. Iris needed to go home, needed to be there. But leaving meant losing this job. Her visa was tied to employment, and hotel policy was clear about extended absences. She was trapped between two impossibilities: stay and keep surviving, or go and lose everything she'd built. Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest. Not pity, but recognition. He understood what it meant to be caught between duty and love, between survival and presence, between the life you'd constructed and the life that was slipping away. He'd chosen wrong once, had been on a business call while his father died, had let fear of vulnerability keep him from saying things that could never be unsaid. He wouldn't let Iris make the same mistake. What happened next, he did without thinking, without calculating consequences or considering optics or protecting himself. He stood, pulled out his phone, made 3 calls, first to his head of HR. Instructions delivered in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Iris Delgado was being granted immediate paid leave, indefinite duration, with full benefits and guaranteed position upon return. Second, to his personal assistant. Arrangements needed immediately, flights, accommodations, whatever was required. No expense spared, no questions asked. Third, to his private physician, a specialist, the best in the country. He'd make a house call, today if necessary, all costs covered. Nathaniel ended the calls and looked at Iris. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read, shock maybe, or disbelief, or the complicated emotion that comes when someone offers you something you desperately need but never thought you deserved. He expected her to thank him, to cry again, to express some version of gratitude. Instead, she said something that gutted him completely. She asked why. Not why he was helping, that was obvious, but why it mattered to him. Why a billionaire who'd spent a year avoiding humanity would suddenly risk everything for a housekeeper he barely knew. And Nathaniel, who'd built an empire on strategy and calculation, answered with the only truth that mattered. Because she'd stayed when he'd told her to leave, because she'd seen him broken and hadn't looked away, because she taught him that presence was the most valuable thing anyone could offer. Because somewhere between collapse and garden soil and silent mornings in break rooms, she'd become the person he measured his life against. Because if love meant anything at all, it meant showing up, even when it was terrifying, even when it cost everything, even when you had no idea if it would be enough. Iris stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. The distance between them felt infinite and non-existent all at once. She reached out, not to embrace him, not to kiss him, but to place her hand over his heart, feeling it beat beneath expensive fabric and careful defenses, a gesture so simple it destroyed him. Then she left the supply closet, left him standing there with the ghost of her touch burning through his chest. 3 hours later, Iris was on a plane. Nathaniel didn't go with her. That would have been intrusive, presumptuous, a violation of the grief that belonged to her alone. But he made sure she wasn't alone in her logistics. Made sure the path between here and there was as smooth as money and power could make it. Made sure that for once in her life, Iris Delgado didn't have to carry everything by herself. The hotel felt different without her, not empty. It was still full of guests and staff and the constant motion of hospitality, but absent, as if something essential had been removed and everyone could feel it but no one could name it. Nathaniel returned to his routines, but they felt hollow now. The rooftop garden without her presence, the break room without her quiet focus, the hallways she'd walked with such purpose. He watered the succulent on his desk and wondered if this was what love felt like. Not the dramatic version from movies, but the quiet, aching awareness that someone else's well-being mattered more than your own comfort. That you'd give everything to ease their pain, even knowing they might never come back. That sometimes the most loving thing you could do was let someone go, and trust that if they returned, it would be because they chose you, not because they needed you. Days passed, then a week. Nathaniel heard nothing, expected nothing. But every morning he woke up and chose to believe that showing up mattered. That presence, even in absence, meant something. That love wasn't about grand gestures. It was about being the kind of person someone wanted to return to. And on a quiet Saturday evening, as rain drummed against the windows of his penthouse, Nathaniel's phone lit up with a message. Just 3 words. She said goodbye. His heart stopped, then broke, then somehow kept beating anyway. Because grief was the price of love, and Iris had taught him that some prices were worth paying. He typed back immediately, not thinking, just feeling. Come home when you're ready. I'll be here. The response came hours later, after midnight, after the city had gone dark and quiet. Thank you for teaching me that asking for help isn't weakness. Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, the same space where he'd collapsed a year ago, and realized something profound. He'd spent a year learning to be alone, and one woman had taught him that being alone and being lonely weren't the same thing. Iris returned 3 weeks later. Nathaniel didn't know she was back until he saw her in the rooftop garden at dawn. Same place, same quiet focus, but something fundamental had changed. She looked lighter, not happier. Grief doesn't work that way. But unburdened, as if she'd set down something heavy and learned to walk without its weight. He approached slowly, uncertain of his place in this new version of her world. She looked up. Their eyes met. And for the first time since that night in the supply closet, she smiled. Small, fragile, real. Nathaniel sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, far enough to give her space to breathe. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. The sunrise painted the city in shades of amber and rose, and in that golden light, something unspoken settled between them. An understanding that transcended words, that lived in presence and proximity and the simple act of existing together. Iris had brought something back with her, a small wooden box worn smooth by time and touch. She opened it carefully, revealing photographs, her mother young and laughing, her mother holding a baby Iris, her mother in a garden surrounded by flowers. Evidence of a life lived fully, love documented in fading images. She showed him without explanation, and Nathaniel understood he was being trusted with something sacred, not just memories, but permission to witness her grief, to hold space for her pain without trying to fix it. He looked at each photograph with the reverence it deserved, seeing not just a stranger's life, but the origin of everything that made Iris who she was. The strength, the gentleness, the capacity to care for broken things. She'd learned it all from a woman who grew flowers in poor soil and taught her daughter that beauty doesn't require wealth, it requires attention. When the last photograph was returned to the box, Iris closed it gently and set it aside. Then she did something that stopped Nathaniel's heart. She leaned against him, just slightly, just enough, resting her head on his shoulder with a sigh that sounded like surrender and relief and trust all at once. Nathaniel froze, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, terrified that any motion might shatter this fragile moment. But slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her. Not possessively, not desperately, just steadily. The way she'd held space for him all those months ago. They sat like that as the sun climbed higher, as the city woke below them, as the hotel began its daily symphony of motion and purpose. And Nathaniel realized this was the moment he'd been waiting for without knowing it. Not a kiss, not a declaration, not some cinematic gesture. Just two people who'd found each other in darkness, choosing to exist together in light. Eventually, Iris straightened, looked at him with eyes that held something he'd never seen there before, not just recognition or understanding, but invitation. She stood, held out her hand. Nathaniel took it without hesitation. She led him through the rooftop door, down the service stairs, through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times but which felt entirely new now. They ended up in the employee break room, that worn, ordinary space where he'd first learned to see his empire as something more than property. Iris made tea, 2 cups, same routine as always, but when she handed him his mug, their fingers touched, deliberate, lingering, electric. And Nathaniel understood that everything had been leading to this moment. Not the grand gesture of saving her, not the dramatic collapse that brought them together, but this, 2 people choosing each other in the quiet, unglamorous spaces where real life happened. Iris set down her mug, stepped closer, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her brown eyes, could feel her breath, could count her heartbeats. She didn't kiss him, not yet. Instead, she placed both hands on his chest, the same gesture from the supply closet, but different now. Not checking if he was real, but claiming that he was. And when she finally closed the distance between them, when her lips met his in a kiss that tasted like tea and grief and hope and tomorrow, Nathaniel felt the last wall inside him crumble, not collapse, not break, dissolve, like snow in sunlight, like fear in the face of something stronger. The kiss was gentle, brief, perfect. When they pulled apart, Iris was smiling, really smiling, the kind that reached her eyes and made the whole world feel possible. She didn't say she loved him, didn't make promises or declarations. She just asked if he wanted to help her repot the winter herbs before her shift started. And Nathaniel, who'd spent a year hiding from life and months learning to live again, said yes. Because love wasn't about grand moments. It was about choosing someone in the small ones. It was soil under fingernails and shared tea and showing up even when it was hard. It was presence, patience, the courage to be seen. They worked side by side in the rooftop garden as morning light flooded the city, planting things that would grow slowly, carefully, with attention and time. And for the first time since his father died, Nathaniel Cross felt something more powerful than grief, more lasting than wealth, more real than any empire. He felt chosen, not for his money, not for his name, not for what he could provide, but for who he was when everything else was stripped away. A man who'd been buried in darkness and learned to grow toward light. A man who'd collapsed and been found. A man who'd discovered that the strongest thing he could ever do was ask for help and offer it in return. And in a rooftop garden above a city of millions, 2 people who'd saved each other planted seeds for a future neither of them could see, but both of them believed in. 2 years later, the rooftop garden had changed. What had once been a functional space for herbs and employee breaks had transformed into something else entirely, a sanctuary designed by Iris and funded by Nathaniel, where staff could find peace between the demands of hospitality. Benches under pergolas, wildflowers mixed with vegetables, a small fountain whose water sang quietly against stone. Not luxury, just care made visible. Nathaniel stood there now, watching the sunset paint everything gold, and marveled at how different his life looked from the man who'd collapsed alone in a penthouse. He still owned the hotel, still made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, still carried the weight of an empire, but he no longer carried it alone. Iris emerged from the rooftop door, dirt on her jeans, hair pulled back, exhausted from a double shift she'd insisted on covering for a co-worker whose daughter was sick. She'd been promoted twice, first to head of housekeeping, then to operations manager. Not because of Nathaniel, but despite him. She'd earned every step through competence, dedication, and the quiet leadership that came from genuinely caring about the people around her. She saw him and smiled, the same smile that had destroyed his defenses 2 years ago, still capable of making his heart stumble. Nathaniel pulled her close, not caring that her uniform was wrinkled or that she smelled like cleaning solution and honest work. She fit against him like she'd been designed for that exact space. They'd built something together that neither could have created alone. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue story, but a partnership forged in mutual respect, in showing up through difficulty, in choosing each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. Iris had taught him that wealth meant nothing without generosity, that power was meaningless without compassion, that success was empty if you had no one to share it with. And Nathaniel had taught her that asking for help wasn't weakness, that her worth wasn't measured in how much she could carry alone, that she deserved care as much as she gave it. Together, they'd transformed the hotel into something neither had imagined, a place where staff were valued, where work had dignity, where the invisible people who made luxury possible were finally seen. Profit hadn't suffered, it had grown, because when you treat people like they matter, they give you their best. Iris pulled back slightly, looked up at him with those steady eyes that still saw through every defense he tried to build. She told him something that made his chest tighten, simple words that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. That her mother would have liked him, would have appreciated the way he'd learned to see beauty in ordinary things, would have approved of a man who watered plants religiously and showed up even when it was hard. Nathaniel felt tears burn behind his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude of being known completely and loved anyway. He kissed her forehead, her temple, the corner of her mouth. Small gestures that said everything words couldn't. The city stretched below them, millions of lights beginning their nightly performance. Somewhere in that vast landscape, other people were collapsing, other people were being found, other people were learning that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. Nathaniel pulled a small box from his pocket, not expensive, not ostentatious, just meaningful. Inside was a ring. Simple silver band with a tiny succulent engraved on the inside. A private joke, a shared memory, a promise. He didn't drop to one knee, didn't make a speech, just held it out and asked the only question that mattered. Iris looked at the ring, then at him, then laughed. A sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. She took the box, slipped the ring on herself, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted like yes and always and home. When they finally pulled apart, Iris whispered against his lips, words he'd never forget, words that healed wounds he'd carried for years. She told him he was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. Not because of what he owned or what he could provide, but because of who he chose to be when no one was watching. Nathaniel held her as the stars emerged overhead, as the city hummed with life below, as the garden they'd built together breathed quietly around them. He thought about the man who'd locked himself away for a year, the man who'd collapsed on a cold floor, the man who'd believed isolation was strength. That man was gone. In his place stood someone better, someone who'd learned that the bravest thing you could ever do was let yourself be seen, let yourself be helped, let yourself be loved. If this story touched you, rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments below. And remember, the strongest people aren't those who never fall. They're the ones who let someone catch them when they do.